Hello everyone, my name is Will Carattini and I am a level designer. I'm going to be talking about three projects. The first one I'm going to talk about is called Biocarnage. Biocarnage was my capstone for UCF, and it is a third-person shooter that is built in the Unreal Engine. I was also the team's only level designer, so I designed, concept, and gray box every area within the game. And when I was brought onto the team, I was tasked with first creating a prototype, which you see right here. And I designed this with some popular games in mind, like Halo and Unreal Tournament. And I designed this level for the prototype to be an arena similar to those two games I just mentioned. So I designed it to be very close quarters, some verticality, to give the player some range of movement, get used to the controls, and get used to some combat. And you can see here, this was the final result of the prototype that allowed us to continue to make the full game. After that happened, I went on to design the desert level in its entirety. Now, I knew from the get-go that it was going to be a linear experience, but I also wanted to give the player a sense of freedom, so that way they know they're not just on one strict path. They had some room to maneuver and explore and hopefully have some fun. So the goal of the desert level was essentially to introduce the player mechanics and combat, as well as hopefully give the player a sense of freedom and being powerful, like they can just mow through all the enemies that you find here. But again, I wanted to ensure that the player had the option to choose their own path. So the way that I went about this, I tried to create three different primary paths. The one on the left was basically for our players who are already familiar with how to move about in the game, whereas the middle one was for our players who liked the combat and just wanted to get into the thick of it. And then finally, the one on the right, the light combat path, was basically our scenic route. This is where you would still have to fight some enemies, but they're fairly small and very easy to get through, and it gives you a nice view of the entire section. After we were done with the desert level, I then went into the metro, where the design for this one was very different from the desert. For one, it was obviously in an interior environment, and it by its nature was modular in design. For this particular level, I heavily relied on 2D maps. So I did a bunch of sketches, I laid them down, and I put them into Photoshop and presented it to my team for approval that you can see here. And once everybody was on board and I was ready to get into the engine, I started implementing my layouts directly into the engine, as you can see here, and then I started constructing the environment around it, like you can see in this first block out. And then afterwards, when the entire block out was made, I then started to focus on lighting, because I knew in this particular level I wanted to contrast with the desert level very starkly, whereas in the desert level I wanted you to feel open and free. In the subway, I wanted you to feel confined and maybe a little even creeped out by the environment. So I made everything really dark and as dingy and as broken as possible. And after the metro level, we get into ground zero. This is very different from the other two areas, where this is more open, but it's also underground. And this also gave me the opportunity to explore the aliens' culture. So in Ground Zero, the goal was to defeat the final boss, but in order to get to it, you have to shut down the power to the surrounding bases. In this case, there were 4, and each base has a different theme. The first one was essentially the alien temple, where they worship the alien boss as kind of like their deity. The second area is basically the metamorph birthing chamber, which is the enemy that was introduced in the ending of the metro that you can see right here. And this happens to be one of my favorite locations because I took some design inspirations from the film 1984. So I wanted to try to emulate that by creating a large screen that the metamorph would stare into. I made the walls, for example, highly reflective, so that way the metamorph, which used to be humans, can see how they've been mutilated and there's no option for them to go back to their humanity, so they just become servants of the aliens. And for the next area is basically the alien hangar. This one is fairly straightforward. I just wanted to show how the aliens are actually mobilized. They are organized, they are efficient, they are powerful, and they have a lot of firepower behind it. And then this last base here is essentially what I call the recycling center. And this is where essentially all of the aliens that have been defeated are sent to basically be broken down and become food for the elder boss. The next game I would like to talk about is called What's the Matter? This game is 2.5D. It was made in the Unity engine, where I acted as both the level designer and the programmer. Now, this project took about 3 to 4 weeks to complete, and it was for my casual games course. Now, the player character could morph between 3 phases: a liquid, a solid, and a gas. The inspiration for the layout of the levels came from this concept art that one of our artists submitted to me, and this inspired all of my subsequent designs. Now, initially, I wanted to introduce each phase of the player character individually by creating these mini rooms, but in the end, we agreed that the mechanics of the player character were so simple that we can just simply combine them into one. So in the beginning, I initially sketched out some blocky designs, since we knew from the beginning that the feeling that I wanted to capture was essentially, since we are a science lab experiment, I get the feeling of being an ant in an ant farm. So I wanted to create that feeling of being confined and being able to see through the environment, to see the lab in the background that you can see in these versions over here. Now, before I started getting heavy into implementing an engine, I just wanted to get the feeling right, which you can see in these images right here. Eventually, we went with the smallest one because we felt that gave us the most confined feeling. And this right here was the first iteration of the prototype that we made for the game, and this just kind of gave us a idea of how the game was going to look, as well as how it was going to behave. After I was happy with the prototype, I basically jumped right into the level blockouts, and that's because of Unity's Pro Builder tool. And it was so efficient, in fact, that I was able to build levels faster than I could draw them, which was amazing. So it allowed me to quickly build and iterate on levels. It allowed us to play test and then essentially just iron out what worked and what didn't work just that much faster. The story in the game for What's the Matter is essentially that you, the player character, wanted to escape from the lab. So the way that I implemented that into the game was through the images that were seen in the background. So you can see in the beginning, you start with the lab proper, and then eventually you work your way into the lobby of the lab, and then the final level takes place above ground, where you eventually finally escape. The final game that I would like to talk about is very unique in this list, in that it is actually a board game that I made with a group of students for our game design course. And the reason why I'm talking about it here is because personally I think it's important as a designer to be able to not only create experiences with the mechanics that are given to me, but also to be able to design the mechanics themselves. For this particular game, I designed the foundational systems, so everything from the initial design of the board itself to the majority of the cards that are used to play, as well as all the rules of movement within the game. I won't delve too much into details about all of the mechanics of the game, but I'll just focus on the most important ones, which are the cards. Every card in the game can be sorted into 5 different categories. The first category are the blue cards, which in essence affect every player on the board immediately. And then we have the yellow cards, which affect the gameplay in some way, and that is followed by the red cards, which directly damage all players. Then we have the green cards, which are essentially your healing cards. And then finally we have the singular black card, and this is reserved for the Grim Reaper, which makes it possible to KO a player immediately. The design of the board was fairly simplistic and served as just mainly something interesting to look at, but an easy reference point for the current status of the game. So you see the game board that I have here, I designed it to be a pentagram, and the reason why I chose this was basically for its historical significance in the world of Magic. And the most arguably the most important spot in this game is the center, which is we call the Nessie node. And you'll see here that this spot is actually a inverted pentagram. And this was a deliberate choice because the inverted pentagram historically is also connected to magic, but has a very negative and evil connotation. And this was my way of introducing a story element to the game board without actually having said anything. As essentially what I'm saying here is that even though you start from positive intention, so essentially outer shape of the pentagon, you will eventually become corrupt as you chase power. So essentially, the old adage here is absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's what I wanted to communicate with the design of this board. And that is my presentation. Thank you again, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.